Is it time to use the dreaded D word? A depression doesn't have to be great. Red lines may wipe out in the stock market, rampant unemployment. The economy can sink into a milder depression, though, the kind spelled with a lowercase d. And it may be happening right now. The trouble is, unlike recessions, which are easier to define, there are no firm rules for what makes a depression. In other words, it's hard to say exactly. Everyone at least seems to agree there hasn't been one since the epic hardship of the 1930s. But with each new hard times headline, most recently an alarming economic contraction of 6.2% in the fourth quarter, it seems much more likely now that the next depression is on its way. Yes, here comes another depression. Actually, we're probably in a depression now, but it's not going to be acknowledged right away, because they say you have to see it behind you, said a business professor at the University of Maryland. No one disputes that the current economic downturn qualifies as a recession. Recessions have two handy definitions, both in effect now: 2 straight quarters of economic contraction, or when the National Bureau of Economic Research makes the call. Declaring a depression is much trickier. By one definition, it's a downturn of 3 years or more with a 10% drop in economic output and unemployment above 10%. The current downturn doesn't qualify yet. So they say 15 months old and 7.6% unemployment. But actually, the unemployment rate is much worse, because it's not counting people that have given up looking for work. Anyway, both unemployment and the 6.2% contraction for late last year could easily worsen day by day. Another definition says a depression is a sustained recession during which the populace or population has to dispose of tangible assets just to pay for everyday living. For some families, that's happening now. Kind of like a reduction in the standard of living. A depression is a recession that does not self-correct because of fundamental structural problems in the economy. And that's what we have here. Again, fundamental structural problems in the whole economy, such as broken banks or a huge trade deficit. And it's also a worldwide economic crisis, a recession, or rapidly becoming a depression. Or maybe a depression is whatever corporate America says it is. Tony James, president of private equity firm Blackstone, called this downturn a depression during an earnings conference call last week. Of course, the Great Depression retains a heavyweight crown so far. Unemployment peaked at more than 25%. From 1929 to 1933, the economy shrank approximately 27%. The stock market lost 90% of its value from boom to bust. But also, these times are like never seen before. It's not exactly the same times. Things are different. They've learned how to manipulate the stock market and the economy better than they could back then. Nonetheless, Few economists expect this downturn will be the sequel, but nobody knows for sure, and nobody can say when or whether the downturn may deepen from a recession to a depression, although it's becoming more likely every day. In his primetime address to Congress last week, President Barack Obama acknowledged difficult and trying times. The next day, the Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke told the House Financial Services Committee that the recession is serious, financial conditions remain difficult. Yes, they are becoming more difficult every day. The economic outlook remains grim. Consumer confidence has fallen off the table. Stocks are at 12-year lows, or even worse. Layoffs come by the tens of thousands, practically every day, and credit remains tight. The current downturn has many of the 1930s characteristics, including being primed by big stock market and real estate booms that turn to bust. Once again, greed, pure greed, has brought this upon us. Policymakers and economists note there are safeguards in place that weren't there in the 1930s. Deposit insurance, unemployment insurance, and ability by the government to throw trillions of dollars at the problem, even if it means printing more money, which is not really a very good idea. Who's going to pay back all these trillions and trillions of dollars? Or they're throwing away billions of dollars like people throw pennies around. Before the 1930s, any serious economic downturn was called a depression. The term recession didn't come into common use until depression became burdened by memories of the 1930s, said a history professor at Millsaps College in Jackson, Mississippi. When the economy collapsed again in 1937, they didn't want to call that a new depression, and that's when they came up with the word recession. Most post-war U.S. recessions have come after the Fed has increased interest rates to cool down rapid economic growth and inflation. Later, the Fed lowers rates and helps restart the economy, with the housing and auto sectors both sensitive to interest rates leading the way. But that's the way it used to be. Once again, these are times like never seen before. Yes, this time is different. As Senate Banking Committee Chairman Chris Dodd, Democrat, Connecticut, said, "Our housing and auto sectors are leading us not out of recession, but into it. What's more, the Fed no longer has the ability to kickstart recovery by lowering interest rates. The central bank has already effectively lowered the short-term rates it controls to zero. And there are no guarantees that the massive economic stimulus package and series of bank bailouts will stave off a nightmare recession, or yes, worse, a depression. Actually, it could even make it worse. It is certainly plausible that the kinds of policy measures that have been good enough to tame the business cycle are no longer adequate in a fast-moving, highly leveraged, highly networked economy. Greed has finally got the best of us. Today's economic indicators don't project a depression, but nonetheless, economic data in 1929 didn't show the stock market crash was about to lead to years of economic misery either. It did not look like the kind of plunge that would be a depression until after the recession began. The Great Depression didn't start out as a depression. It started out as a recession. Yes, and once again, these times are like nobody's ever seen before. There's much more going on here. Something bigger is going on. And once again, all these things are connected to the end times, transition days,